paying tribute to their former leader, Fidel Castro. What does the future hold for Cuba now that he's gone? Hello, I'm Nathan King, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. After a week of mourning, Cubans continue to say goodbye to their former leader, Fidel Castro. Hundreds of thousands have come out to pay their respects these last few days and see his coffin as it's driven across Cuba in a funeral procession. His final resting place is Santiago de Cuba, and his ashes will be interred there on Sunday. In a few minutes, we'll talk about the future of Cuba post-Fidel. But we begin with CCTV correspondent Michael Voss, who joins us now from Santiago de Cuba. Michael, thanks so much for being here. You have been in Cuba for many, many years. Everyone knew this day was coming, but there you are now in Santiago de Cuba. What's the preparations like for this really quite historic moment?
Nathan, I'm in Santiago's Revolution Square, where they're putting the finishing touches to the final mass tribute to Fidel, which will take place here on Saturday night. You can probably see there are the big screens behind me. Now, the mass rally in Havana on Tuesday was very much of a political affair. A number of world leaders, speeches from world leaders, singing the praises, discussing Fidel Castro. There was South Africa's Jacob Zuma, there was Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro. This event in Santiago will be much more for the people. There's going to be music. Music has actually been banned for the past week for the whole of the 9 days of official mourning here in Cuba. No bands in any of the cafes or bars, but there will be music here tonight as a tribute to Fidel Castro before, as you say, he is interned Sunday morning at the main cemetery here in Santiago.
It's been quite incredible to watch Cubans across the country, sometimes waiting 12 hours or more just to catch a glimpse of their former leader. What can you tell us about the ceremony on Sunday and the preparations for that? And also, of course, a lot of world leaders coming in to pay tribute, as they have been all week.
Yes, a very Cuban affair in many ways. Very little details of just what's going to happen on Sunday. The interment will take place at 7 o'clock in the morning. It's in the classic cemetery, Santa Ifigenia, really the most historic of Cuba's cemeteries. It's where José Martí, the most revered leader of the independence movement against Spain, his mausoleum is there. Fidel will be very close to him, and a lot of other guerrilla fighters from the Sierra Maestra Mountains are buried there. There are also fighters from the independence wars, along with musicians and others in that cemetery. No official guest list yet of who's going to attend. We do know that, for example, China's Vice President Li Yuanchao will be there. We're expecting a lot of heads of state from Latin America and also from Africa. Perhaps the big gap, if you like, those who are not attending, comes from Europe. The Spanish king we do expect, but a lot of European countries have spent a lot of effort in the last year and a half courting Cuba. We've had them coming to Havana. France's President Hollande, for example, paid a state visit to Cuba, talking to Raúl Castro now that the reforms are underway. But it does appear as if these Europeans don't want to be too closely associated with Fidel Castro. The same with Canada's Justin Trudeau. He was here only a week or so ago, again meeting Raúl Castro. Fidel Castro went to his father's funeral, but after being criticized for writing a completely non-critical article tribute to Fidel, Justin Trudeau's decided he isn't going to come either.
Fascinating stuff, and it's incredible to see Fidel Castro returning to Santiago de Cuba, where, of course, he launched that drive back in 1959 all the way to Havana and assume power. Quite incredible. Michael Voss is going to stay with us throughout the program, which is great. But joining us also from Havana is Juan Jacomino. He is the longtime journalist and former press liaison officer here in the Cuban interest section here in Washington, D.C., which is actually now the embassy. With us from Rio de Janeiro is Rafael Salier. He's the director of Brazil operations for Southern Pulse, a firm focused on building understanding of Latin American issues. And also here with me in the studio is James Early. He is a former director at the Smithsonian and has visited Cuba more than 50 times. And of course, Michael Voss, still with us, as I said, in Santiago de Cuba. Juan Jacomino in Havana, I know we've got a slight delay. Can I just ask you, what is the mood like in Cuba? Obviously looking back on Fidel Castro's legacy, but also must be looking forward too.
Well, thank you, Nathan. Indeed, this has been a period of grief that has been taken by people mostly private, family-oriented, but now the streets have been full of Cubans paying tribute to Fidel. It is indeed amazing to see the crowds. It is also amazing the show of support that the Cuban Revolution of Fidel Castro is getting after so many years in power. Cubans have come out to express mourning, but also in many ways expressing support. So the future looks to Cuba as could have been expected. He was 90. He himself had said that at some point he would go. Cubans, I don't think, were prepared for that. He was larger than life size. He was a giant of this century. He was a big political figure in Cuba. He's probably the greatest political figure in Cuba ever. Of course, that will have to be of historians to assess, but it's big in his own dimension. But the Cuban Revolution seems to be staying very much its course at a time when there's a new administration in the U.S. We'll have to see what it brings, because it all boils down to U.S.-Cuba in so many ways. Cuba is in a process of changes, economic changes and social changes that are going on, and that will certainly continue. Now, probably supported by this show of support that we have seen over the last few days by the general population, and also, I should point, a lot of young people also voicing support for Fidel, expressing their admiration, their feelings for this great Cuban leader, because he was certainly one of the greatest in this island, only 90 miles away from the United States.
And some would say a world away as well. Juan, let's pause there with the question mark over U.S.-Cuban relations and talk about the region. Rafael Salier, obviously Fidel Castro left his mark not just on Cuba, but the Latin American region as a whole. Exporting revolution very much on the cards in the 60s. But what's his legacy, and also how does the region now fit around this reform in Cuba that Juan Jacomino was just talking about?
Well, his main legacy is inspiring the region's left, and a lot of the region's youth movements who tend to be leftist. Fidel Castro was the last of the three main revolutionary icons of the Cuban Revolution, along with Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos. One died early and the other one died shortly after. So Fidel was the last remnant of these three icons of a revolution that inspired Latin American youths throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Partially, you can talk about his legacy as being that really in Latin America, beyond the political left, there was nothing left. With the end of the Cold War, a lot of the guerrilla movements died down. You had FARC as the last remnant in Colombia. You had a little bit of the Sendero Luminoso in Peru, but even those are about, or have ended or morphed into something very different than they used to be during the Cold War, right? In terms of government, right now, Fidel Castro was a personal friend of Hugo Chavez, and that's probably his last remaining big mark on the region right now. And the support that Cuba receives from the Chavista government in Venezuela, and the support that it gives to the Chavista government inside Venezuela, is probably his longest legacy at this moment. Cuba is kept afloat by cheap Venezuelan oil. and it keeps the Venezuelan regime very much well informed, as well as driving a number of social programs in the country, which is like very interesting to think of, because these are the two things that the Cuban government that Fidel Castro put in place are known for.
Yes.
Very well successful social policies, as well as a very informed security regime.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I want to bring in James Early here, who's been to Cuba 50 times over the span of decades. Things change in Cuba, but they also remain the same. And the one thing that I was struck with when I first went was how tranquil and peaceful a society it is compared to the region, how well educated everyone is, how well fed despite seeming poor, and obviously the hospital treatment. Have you seen that change at all? And what do you see changing now? Fidel Castro has obviously been out of power a decade. His brother Raul is there, but potentially stepping down in 2018. Are you seeing changes?
Well, first of all, this was a nationalist revolution in 1959. Although Fidel Castro was a Marxist, he was more of a follower of Jose Marti than he was a follower of Karl Marx, and he followed both. And I think
it was the liberation of the poor, really.
Right. I think it's very important to point out this was a nationalist revolution, and Fidel Castro is his legacy will be a social justice ethic that galvanized people around humanitarian concerns. That's been executed by stewards of government who don't have the charisma of Fidel Castro, but who have done quite well in the institutionalization of a healthcare system, of an educational system, of a profound cultural contribution, not only across Cuba, but to the globe. And therein, we have to grasp the complexity of Fidel Castro as a towering individual, a man of 30 years of age when he left November 25th, 1959. Who had already associated himself against Trujillo in the Dominican Republic and against a dictatorship in Colombia. But it's his social construct, not his individual construct. As he said, my work is not done in the office, it's done engaging people, sitting in the field with farmers, with dirt in his hand, talking to them, listening to them, instruct him. And so that the institutionalization of his social ethic policy will indeed continue, and has already evolved in the context of Raul Castro, his brother, who was nominated and approved by the National Assembly as president.
I want to go back to Michael Voss, our correspondent, who is actually in Santiago de Cuba, obviously waiting for that funeral on Sunday. The Cuban government, the Cuban party will be there, obviously paying their respects. Everyone will be looking at Raul Castro, obviously Fidel's brother, but there are other people there too who may end up running Cuba. One name that keeps on popping up is Miguel Diaz-Canel. I think I pronounced it right, Michael. He's sort of waiting in the wings. Now that Fidel Castro has passed, what are we likely to see in terms of policy? Because he did have quite a big effect even after he stepped down, right, Michael?
I think if we're going to talk about what sort of policy changes we might see under Raul Castro without Fidel Castro in the picture any longer, the one question we have to ask is just how much influence did Fidel have in the last 10 years when he was ill and he stepped down? Certainly Raul Castro had said that he would always consult Fidel on major issues of policy. Later, he said, half jokingly at the last Communist Party Congress, that there were two political parties in Cuba, one who followed Raul, one who followed Fidel. I think up to a point it was very useful for Raul Castro, who had surrounded himself. He's put all his own people in place. They are Raul's people in the cabinet, in the Communist Party. But when he pushed through major changes like the opening up of the economy to the private sector, which took place at the Communist Party Congress in 2011. Fidel came on the last day, he attended it, he raised Raul's hand, with the message was that he knew what was going on and he was happy about it. But then later, more recently, he's become a figurehead for those who are more fearful of change, who are more worried about change. After President Obama came here earlier this year, that historic visit, Fidel Castro wrote a scathing article in the Communist Party newspaper, highly critical of the visit, really indicating that he thought it was a mistake. And that Communist Party Congress was all about anti-Americanism. There was none of the expected reforms were discussed at all. So in some ways, people here think he has become a figure. He had become a figurehead for the hardliners, for those who weren't that keen on change. So maybe now that he's gone, it will be possible to move change forward, maybe a slightly bolder approach with the economic policies. Maybe it'll be easier to open up to foreign investment. I know you're going to bring up Trump later on, but I just want to make one point here. The whole thing may be messed up if Donald Trump goes ahead and says what he will, which is, you know, Cuba must make further reforms, you must do this or I'll turn everything back. Cuba's reaction to being told that there are negotiations with precondition are to go in the opposite direction and say we hold firm, we've lived without the US for 50 years, we'll do so again. And it may actually slow down the pace of reform because they don't want to be seen to be reacting under pressure to make changes.
We will talk about Trump, we'll also talk about the rest of the world and the changes in Cuba after this short break. Do stay with us. More on the expectations for Cuba after it says final farewell to its longtime leader Fidel Castro when we come right back. Welcome back to The Heat. We're talking about Cuba and what happens next after the fact that Fidel Castro has died. And we want to go straight to Havana and Juan Jacomino, the former spokesperson here in Washington, D.C. at the Cuban Interest Section, which is now, of course, the embassy. Juan, you and I have talked many times about Cuban policy going forward, but now that Cuba is at this crossroads, do you see reforms continuing, privatization, more professions being allowed to go into the open market, the internet, for example, which is only about 6% of households at the moment, but if you wander around the public spaces where it's available, extremely popular. Are you going to see more of this, do you think, now that Fidel's passed and Raul continues until 2018? And what about this figure, Miguel Diaz-Canel, that everyone has been talking about? Tell us your thoughts.
Well, yes, certainly the changes will continue in Cuba. Actually, Cuban citizens across the island have been asked to sign, in the framework of Fidel Castro's passing and the funeral, we have all been asked to sign a pledge of allegiance of some kind to Fidel Castro's revolutionary ideas. And the second precept in that pledge says, in words of Fidel Castro himself, changing all that needs to be changed. That, to me, is not there by chance. So Cuba, it means Cuba will continue changing. Cuba has been changing, but like Michael Voss was saying, the U.S.-Cuba situation permeates, it's very pervasive. And of course, if we were not 90 miles away from the U.S. and were we to be in a different kind of relationship, things could be very different in this island nation that has lived for decades in a virtual state of siege. Of course, if a new U.S. administration imposes that siege mentality, believe me, Nathan, this island is used to that. We're good at living under siege. We can put on a good fight, but we don't want that. We want Yes. We want better relations.
I'm glad you mentioned that Cuban attitude, because it is something I've experienced. It's sort of, well, if the US wants to, then bring it on, sort of thing. James Early, I want to bring you in here. Obviously, we're at a crossroads here with the US administration as well. Obama really sort of opening up, burying the hatchet as far as he could go without lifting the embargo, of course, which the US Congress has to do. And then Trump tweeting out immediately after Castro is dead, you know, dictator's dead, they've got to change, they've got to open up more reforms. What do you think is going to happen? And I know this is a difficult question when it comes to the president-elect. And what do you think Cuba's reaction will be?
Well, let me start with Cuba's reaction, because I think we have to deal with Cuba in its actuality.
Of course.
Not in what might happen. Under the Raul Castro administration, there's been widespread debate in Cuba about the strengths and virtues of their revolution, about their own failures, their own errors, in addition to the embargo. And there is widespread policy discussion about freedom of the press, variations in Granma, the official organ of the Communist Party, issues of racism. Cubans have been very vigorous, very active under the construct of participatory democracy. Raul Castro the Communist Party, you are indispensable, but you are not the state, and you, most importantly, are not the citizens. We have to re-understand the calibration of this triad with the citizens at the center. Cuba is well embedded in the Caribbean and in Latin America, with all of the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean supporting Cuba in regional policies and explicitly saying to Canada and the United States, you are excluded. Although 99% of them have bilateral ties with the United States, they're saying out of our mutual interest, Cuba is a full partner and you cannot dictate. So I think
like the CELAC community with the Caribbean, for example.
The community of Latin American and Caribbean nations, Petrocarib, UNASUR, and others. So I think if we grasp the engagement and Cuban stewards of government about their own policies and where they're going, then we look at what the context of the U.S. is. The people of the United States have asked to get rid of this blockade. Most of the people in the United States, including most of Cuban and Americans in Miami, disagree with the blockade. They want to go back and forth. I flew in on Tuesday on the inaugural flight of JetBlue waving Cuban flags. That is a result of the U.S. citizens saying, we want our rights to go back and forth. So in this context enters the Trump administration. It will have to deal with the logic of corporations in capital. The Chamber of Commerce, the National Chamber of Commerce of the United States, went down to Havana to meet with the Cubans well before President Raul Castro and President Barack Obama started their diplomatic engagement.
So you think the door's already open too wide to shut it?
Right. Now Trump will have a lot of rhetoric, and the U.S. State Department will continue to try to undermine Cuba and through USAID for democracy. But there's cooperation going on. Patents have been signed on vaccines for cancer. Cuba is one of the leading biotechnology countries in the world. And so there will be this push and pull and complexity, and I think that's what we have to look at is how will the Cuban people continue to mediate? How will their relationships with Latin America and the Caribbean go? And that will be a leverage on how the United States government is able to engage or not with Cuba.
I want to bring in Rafael Salier here because I think what you raised an excellent point is how's the region going to react vis-a-vis U.S.-Cuba relations, because the region was applauding what Obama was doing. It took away a big thorn between U.S. relations and the rest of the region, and now it could potentially be in a bit of reverse when it comes to Cuban policy, Rafael.
The irony is that when Obama announced his rapprochement with Cuba, I think only Nicolas Maduro was the only one that was quite surprised, as that worked against his own internal policies and discourse. Now, that being said, there is a history in the region of supporting a rapprochement between the United States and Cuba and ending the Cuban embargo, partially because even the right in Latin America tends to be center more than right when the right in Europe or the United States. If you look at the main politicians on the Brazilian right, for example, they all sent out congratulatory, mournful statements, remembering how iconic Fidel Castro was, not only for Cuba, but for Latin America as a whole. And this includes the former presidential candidate, Aécio Neves. That being said, the region's looking at Donald Trump and anything he might do to Cuba as secondary, specifically because the region is more worried about any Trump policy that might hurt it first. Right? So Mexico's worried about not only the wall, but ending NAFTA. Brazil was worried with any number of trade tariffs he might put up, or basic instability, which would affect not only the value of the real, but also the amount of investment, foreign investment, that Brazil would receive. And Cuba is only an afterthought.
Right.
Now, that being said, Donald Trump's current cabinet choices tend to show that he's leaning on your old school Cuban Miami individuals, or linked to old school Cubans from Miami, for his Latin American policy, which tends to think that he's going to harshen the U.S. relationship with Cuba. Now, that being said, a good way to think about it is that there's going to be a dual pull on Donald Trump, where one part of his cabinet, the policy people, are going to be pushing for a harsher relations, while business-linked individuals, which are making up a large portion of his cabinet, are going to be pushing for opening up with Cuba so that they can invest, so that they can make money inside Cuba or with relations with the island.
Rafael, thanks so much, and that echoes exactly what James earlier was saying about this push-pull before different interests in the US. Juan Jacomito, I just want to go to you. Obviously, Cuba's standing in the world has changed a little bit too. It used to export revolution, but it helped brought about peace with Colombia and the FARC rebels recently. Where is Cuban foreign policy going now?
Well, Cuba, a long time ago, even Fidel Castro himself said that, at least for Latin America, the revolutionary armed struggle was not the solution. Cuba helped Colombia attaining peace. Cuba is in a unique position. Actually, when you look at Cuba 2 months back, you don't have to look a whole year back, 2 months back, you see dozens of heads of states coming to Cuba. It's virtually 2 per week or something like that. So Cuba is pretty well connected with the world. The attitude in the world towards Cuba, I would say, is a positive one. And so is Cuba's attitude to the world. Cuba has always shown solidarity, at least with the third world. And now the big nations, Europe, everybody is turning to Cuba after, of course, sadly enough, only after.
Yeah. Well, Juan, thanks so much. I want to just get a final word before we close from Michael Voss, our correspondent in Santiago de Cuba. Just one final question. Are Cubans hungry for sort of the capitalism they see in the United States and Latin America, or do they really want to keep their social contract, which doesn't make them rich, but certainly makes them healthy, very well educated?
I mean, I think there is push-pull here again. I mean, they're very worried about losing their healthcare and education. They're extremely on that. But if there is one thing that you do feel there is pressure on the streets for, it's for economic change. It's for the right to, the ability to earn a decent living. That is really what the majority, particularly the young, want. And a lot of them, if they're feeling they can't get it, are leaving the country. This really is the biggest challenge now that Raul Castro's administration faces, is how to put more bread on the table and more money in people's pockets.
Michael, thanks so much. We'll be talking to you throughout the weekend. That's it for this edition of The Heat. CCTV will continue to bring you lots more coverage as Cubans pay their final respects to their former leader, the historic Fidel Castro. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.